It's a pleasure to be here, and I have a social story that I wrote for you. It's titled, Information About Today's Presentation. I am attending a presentation. Carol is the speaker. This presentation contains very new material, so Carol may seem a little surprised by some of the slides. This is okay. Carol often decides to make changes in her presentation after she sends in her handout originals to the conference organizers. Well, not just often, she does it every time. There may be omissions or new material. This is also okay. This icon marks silent slides in my handouts. Silent slides contain information that Carol will not be covering live. That way, Carol can share additional detail without using presentation time. With so much information in my handouts, this is the kind of plenary session where people may decide to listen and not take notes. This is okay with Carol. Carol hopes that I enjoy this presentation. And so, we're going to talk about social stories. Past, we're going to reflect a bit how they originated, how they were started. Then we're going to look at the middle, where we kind of rebooted our understanding of social stories, a bit of a social story renaissance. And then we are going to look to the future. So reflect. We're going to have to go back to 1997. This is a photograph of myself with my first 4 students. At this point, I'm about 2 months into my career as a teacher, and I was entrusted with 4 very special children diagnosed with autism. I kept a journal because the only information that I had to work on for educating children with autism was a book, one book about autism. And so to keep track of myself in this experience where so much was not understood and where I was frequently overwhelmed, every day I would sit down and I would take notes. Notes about my students and also notes about myself. More puzzling is to wonder what each child is seeing. Perhaps seeing the same thing, but perceiving it differently. I wasn't the only one that was overwhelmed. In fact, that would continue for several years. 12 years into the future, Dr. Siobhan Timmons in the United Kingdom, I didn't know her, but her son Mark was diagnosed with autism. And it was a time now marked by a lot of trends in the field of autism. And a lot of opposing opinions. Well, at about this time, our program received a federal grant. It was called the Challenge Grant. And the challenge was, could people with autism, autistic people, be educated alongside their peers in general education classes? And could these students who were older, could they perhaps participate in jobs in the community? So we said, yes, we think that's entirely possible, and we began to implement the grant. What this meant was that our students were now out in the community. How do we supervise all of these kids in all of these different places? So we had a few coaches, but we also started educating people in the community. And we learned very, very fast what was critically important in teaching and that which maybe was not so important. And so I had to develop a curriculum where we could teach from far, far away. Because now the students were not in my immediate care all the time. And so we started writing notes for them. And it was working. A philosophy developed. I mean, when you're educating people with the world watching your every move, you better have some pretty solid ethical standards, and you better do things right. And we developed a philosophy. It would later become the social story philosophy, and it is to this day. First of all, you have to abandon all assumptions. It is not easy for typical people to abandon their assumptions. Let me give you an example. This is a photograph taken this year, before I changed my hair. I am with my sister. My sister and I go away each year to sister camp. And every year when we get together, we end up sharing those events from childhood. And what's interesting is that even though we grew up in the same family, with the same people, as we recount those childhood experiences, we each have a different take on what happened in those situations, a different interpretation, sometimes diametrically opposed interpretations of the motivation, the feelings, etc., of the people that surrounded us at that time, which really does raise an interesting question, doesn't it? That if each of us goes through life with our own unique personality, talents, etc., our own unique brain that we bring to planet Earth, and then that unique brain is interpreting and responding to the world around it, and we don't have agreement on simple shared experiences, it does raise the question, who among us knows exactly what's going on? And it makes it very important when we start to write social stories that we gather information first and abandon those assumptions that we make in an effort to get closest to sharing the accurate scoop with the people in our care. Another part of the social story philosophy is that every social impairment is a shared impairment. If you look up the word social in the dictionary, you discover that it requires, by definition, more than one person. What that means is I've never observed a social impairment in a person who is alone. And it definitely means that we're part of the problem. It also means that we are a huge part of the solution. Also, another social story premise is that when you're working with people, autistic people, you're working from two equally valid but different takes on what's going on. And it's critically important to never argue perception. Have you ever been in an interaction with anyone where it seems like you've had that conversation before, but you're having it again, and you're having it again, and you're having it again? I submit, in those interactions, we may be guilty of arguing perception instead of the more efficient social route of, here's how it looks to me, I really want to understand how it looks to you, and how can we proceed to the next step? How can I help you find your effective response to this situation? We also learned gradually that curiosity is confusion with a good attitude. One thing that happens with people when they become confused and overwhelmed is their thinking becomes restrictive. And what we have to do when we work with other people is we have to be open and comfortable with confusion so that we can relax and come up with some solutions. So we found that writing things down was very helpful for our students. And I started thinking, would it work elsewhere? By this time, I was a consultant, no longer a teacher in a classroom. They were placing very young children on my caseload, and it was my job to support teachers as they worked, and parents, as they worked with children with autism. The first social story was actually written for a little guy named Tim, age 5. He was diagnosed with autism, to describe a game in his physical education class. I went to observe Tim in his physical education class, and the teacher announced that they were going to play the game Charlie Over the Water. Initially, he was confused as they played the game, and he quickly became overwhelmed. And at the end of the session, I asked her if she could repeat that game again the following week. She agreed, and I went back to my office, and I simply wrote a story describing how to play Charlie Over the Water. Tim, despite his young age, could read and comprehend information at a 3rd grade level. This is page 3 from the story. One game is called Charlie Over the Water. When we play, we say this rhyme. Charlie over the water, Charlie over the sea, Charlie catches blackbirds, but he can't catch me. Tim read the story each day, once a day, just prior to physical education class. They come in the following week. The teacher announced they were going to play the game again. Tim's hand went up. He wanted to be Charlie. So he was Charlie. And he was relaxed, he was happy, he was having fun. If I had not known that this was a child with an autism diagnosis, I never would have picked him. Well, I might have picked him out because occasionally he was stopping other kids if they got that little rhyme wrong. But other than that, it was an experience for me where literally my mouth dropped open. I had never seen anything work so well for one of my students. So we started writing more stories. Stories about going out to recess, standing in line, and most of those early stories were descriptions of what was going to happen next, beginning to recognize that the best surprise is no surprise. So we would write about field trips, etc. And we started sharing what we were seeing in a newsletter called The Morning News. What we do know is that for some children with autism, reading the answers, reading what we now refer to as social stories, is bringing some positive, immediate, and often very dramatic results. We were intrigued. It seemed like magic, but that's only because we really didn't understand what we were seeing. And the more we started gathering information, the more we understood. Stories work for all people. We are wired for story. Storytelling is actually a human universal. And these characteristics of stories, the research shows, reveal clues about the very essence of what it means to be human. We've been telling stories forever. And stories are an important tool for learning and for developing relationships within one's social group. Stories may be an important proving ground for vital social skills. So all social stories we're doing, we're making story meaningful for my students. The first formal article describing social stories was by myself and Joy Garand. In that article, we said, these experiences with social stories indicate, and we posed a theory, that some students with autism may be more impaired in their access to social information than they are in their ability to come up with effective responses when they have meaningfully understood that information. And so the first approach, it would seem, to teaching people with autism would be to share the secret social code, share how it looks to us, but never argue perception. Social stories now are an evidence-based practice. And in 2010, the National Autism Center listed story-based intervention package with social stories listed as the most commonly used and the most widely known as being an effective intervention. Well, we pay attention to the research on social stories and definitely respect it. And that research has helped us to update our understanding as time has gone on. And the social story criteria have been revised to reflect new understandings, although the heart of the social story criteria have not changed that much. It's more been a reorganization as we went from Social Stories 10.2 to Social Stories 10.1 to the current Social Stories 10.2. So this is the current definition of a social story. A social story accurately describes a context, skill, achievement, or concept according to 10 defining criteria. One thing I want to mention about that, notice that the definition is focused on authors, the people who write the story. A social story describes. Who's describing? Us. Social stories have never been about changing the response or the behavior of a person with autism. They've mostly been about structuring our response when we're overwhelmed. So a social story accurately describes a context, skill, achievement, or concept according to 10 defining criteria. These criteria guide story research, development, and implementation to ensure an overall patient and reassuring quality and a format, a voice, a content, and a learning experience that is descriptive, meaningful, and critically important, physically, socially, and emotionally safe for the audience of the story, who is a child, adolescent, or adult. The research now has helped us to understand that social stories actually are helpful for a wide variety of people, including typically developing children. Well, words are very important, and how we use words in a social story are very important. And right from the beginning, we were using what we called insurance policy terms. Terms like usually, sometimes, to be accurate. For example, the assembly is scheduled for Wednesday is preferable to saying that there will be an assembly Wednesday, because what if that assembly is canceled and has to be postponed? The word scheduled sets the groundwork so that we can then say and link it to, oh, the assembly has been rescheduled. And so we decided in the social story book, we have to describe what we mean by words that we use frequently, that we just kind of know what we mean. But what's the difference between often and sometimes and frequently. So we got down to details, and we defined that. Social stories are all about being accurate. And today, we're starting to use social stories in different ways. To teach concepts, Dr. Temple Grandin has shared with us that she was 26 years old before she knew what a dog was. And when you think about it, there's a lot of variety within concept dog in terms of size, appearance. So can we write a social story to begin the conversation about what is a dog? Well, we can, and we have to be careful with the words that we use. This is a story about dogs, just dogs. This is a story about dogs, just dogs. This is a photo of a dog. Now, I can't say this is a dog because that would not be literally correct. This is not a dog. This is a photo of a dog. But I would love to just be able to say this is a dog on subsequent pages. So what I do is I say this is a photo of a dog, and I explain. Sometimes people say this is a dog when they see a photo like this. Now that allows me on subsequent pages to go, this is a dog. This is a dog. I have 2 of these at home. These are dogs and a pig. A pig? A pig. A pig does not belong in this story. That's better, because this is a story about dogs, just dogs. Social stories went through a bit of a renaissance, largely because of the work of Dr. Peter Vermeulen and the book Autism as Context Blindness. I read the book, and at the same time I had been writing articles about the importance of context, and so Peter's work was so exciting to me. Peter has said people with autism have a keen eye for details, but not for all details. They seem to excel in those details for which context does not play a role, which, of course, as an educator and the person responsible for social stories, what can we do with social stories to make them more responsive to and helpful in teaching contextual information? Well, Peter Vermeulen says we have to push the context button. And when it comes to social stories, what that means is we have to use contextualized script. In other words, script that makes references to contextual information that you and I just readily take for granted that everybody knows. So we have stories like this one that use contextualized script, and you'll notice as I share this story with you that it refers to events, several different contexts within this big context of taking a flight. This story is called Waiting to Fly. My name is Pete. I am going to ride in an airplane. I will probably have to wait. Oh, Pete, you will have to wait. People often have to wait at check-in. Many people may need to check their luggage or get boarding passes. People often wait in the boarding area. Different context, but same activity. They wait for the pilot and crew to get the plane ready to fly. People often need to wait for the plane to go. They need to wait for the crew to make sure everything is ready for the flight. Here depicting an unseen context that causes us to wait. People often need to wait for other reasons too. Waiting happens a lot when people fly in airplanes. I am going to fly in an airplane soon. I may have to wait often. Well, thinking of context and beginning to think broader and not just describing things in advance, we started to realize there's a lot more that we can do with social stories than we originally thought. It's a bigger picture. I had a student that did not want to brush his teeth, but he loves relay races. And I thought, brushing your teeth is connected to a variety of different contexts, and it is kind of like a relay race. The people at the factory make the toothpaste, and then that is taken to the store, and then it goes from the store. It's a relay race. And then it comes home in a grocery sack, and then somebody has to carry it upstairs, and then you are there at the finish line to brush your teeth. The story was immediately effective. And before the fries were mine, where do these French fries come from? Everything is the result of human teamwork. And I think that's important to demonstrate to people with autism. Remember Siobhan Timmons? Well, she attended one of my earliest workshops in the United Kingdom, right after her son Mark was diagnosed. She came back year after year after year, each year updating her information on social stories, each year learning more about social stories, and each year bringing somebody different from her son Mark's team, ultimately creating a group of people around her son Mark who all shared the same philosophy, the same quest for understanding how it looks to another person, the same vantage point. And she has written stories all of Mark's life. He is now in his 20s, and she is sharing those stories with us. It's unprecedented. I know of no other collection of stories through the lifespan. And she provides us with such a wonderful description of how she came up with each topic and the effort she went through to make sure that he would understand the information in the story. And so, this is the first of 3 books. It's available now, and I'm so excited about this book because it is a true demonstration of genuine social stories. We're doing other things too to try to protect the integrity and the quality of social stories. We have a logo, and you can look for it on our materials, on books, etc. It is an indication that this is the genuine article because social stories, unfortunately, are highly imitated. If you type in on a Google search, social stories in quotes, up comes about 600,000 sites. Imitation, I guess, is a form of flattery. But I know of only one site that I'm directly involved with about social stories, and it's carolgraysocialstories.com. And there's a ton of information on that site, a ton of articles, excerpts, many, many excerpts from my first journals and my first experiences with people with autism. And you can see in detail how social stories basically were the logical outcome of being confused for a good many years. We also have satellite programs. The first satellite program, these are model programs where they can conduct social story workshops. They have my PowerPoint presentation. They are working in direct collaboration with me to protect the quality of the approach. And we have them in England. Fremantle School actually has a booth here, I believe, and also in Ireland and Scotland. We also have satellites in the United States. So, what's next? Well, I'm getting very curious about social stories. Looking at them again. What are they really? And I've been looking for their cousins in the literary world. And I've discovered, okay, social stories are very strictly defined. It is a strictly defined format, like a haiku. Either something is a haiku or it isn't. And in this world of social stories, if you don't follow all of the 10 criteria, we do not consider it to be a social story. It's a short document on a specific subject, kind of like an essay, descriptive like an essay. But there's an emphasis on accuracy and gathering information, very much like a research paper. And you know what? I just discovered social stories have a very close cousin in a place where I never thought I would find that. Universal design. I am on the advisory board for Delta Airlines. I represent autism with Delta Airlines. And Delta is very concerned about making sure that everyone has a comfortable flight. And they've become very interested in universal design. As I looked at the elements of universal design, I realized that there are so many similarities between the elements of universal design and the social story criteria. Not only that, but if you want to create environments based on universal design, just like social stories, you have to ascribe to a certain philosophy first. And even though universal design is often considered to be about places, making it wheelchair accessible or accessible for people with small stature, et cetera, it's far more than that. It's all about communication. And I think it's even bigger than that. I think there is a basic human truth about how we can make the world accessible, fully accessible to all people. Access isn't only about buildings or ramps, it's about all elements of context, including the assumptions that we bring into those places and the decisions that we make within them. Last week, Friday, I went to see a movie that just came out in the United States. It's called Sully. It's about the US Airways pilot who landed a commercial aircraft in the Hudson River in the middle of New York City. They had just taken off when this aircraft was hit by what they call a bird strike. A flock of birds, they believe probably to be Canadian geese, came flying at the aircraft and into both engines, causing loss of power in both engines. So just after takeoff, this is a plane without power. And so the pilot Sully determines that based on his experience and his assessment of what is going on, they can't possibly land at LaGuardia or at a smaller airport that was suggested off to their right. They would have to use another landing strip, the Hudson River. When the FAA investigators started researching and looking at the data that they had, started recreating the flight with their flight simulators, they sat down with Sully and they said, you know, when you crashed the plane into the Hudson River, to which Sully corrected them and said, I did not crash that plane into the Hudson River. It was a water landing. But they said, it can't be a water landing because a water landing has never been successfully accomplished by a commercial aircraft before. It's unprecedented. Unprecedented means that it has just happened for the very first time. If it's a crash, then Sully, as the pilot, was out of control, engaging in behavior outside of what is expected of a pilot, and he would lose his pension, his retirement. If it was a water landing, he's one of the most gifted pilots on the planet. Our assumptions are social factors, continually apparent in the words that we choose, whether in shared observations, discussions, decision-making, or the stories that we write for the people in our care. The FAA investigators insisted that the left engine was still working and that Sully could have made it to LaGuardia. But Sully said, no, we lost the left engine. And that basically is a controversy that goes through most of the movie. They did lose the left engine. If they had gone for LaGuardia Airport like they were originally directed to do, several hundred, if not thousands of people would have died. When we're working with people with autism, well, each of us actually, we're all in our own cockpit of experience. And it's our job to help everybody find their own landing among us. So that's why in social stories, we've now outlawed certain terminology. Terminology like inappropriate. Inappropriate doesn't tell me anything about how it looks to another individual. Inappropriate is just how it might look to us, but that doesn't mean how it is. So, what is a social story? Well, as we look at them again, maybe they're this. A social story structures how we regard that which we don't fully understand, so that we may see beyond our assumptions, especially those assumptions which are in error, if only for the time that it takes us to develop this story, so we might accurately regard these incredible people who are standing right in front of us, so that we may play a safe, helpful, and supportive role that will enable him or her to make his or her own unique landing and effective contribution to life here on planet Earth. Thank you very much.
We've got time for a couple of questions.
Sure.
I'd like to thank Carol very much for that presentation. It was great. We have time for 2 questions before we move on to the next presentation. So if you could raise your hand if you have a question for Carol. There's one here. Do we have a second? No, if we just take the one question.
Look at that, I right at 9:40. That's
You were perfect.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask you, how can you, for example, train parents in your, together with your clients, how can you train parents to accurately structure their life or their children's life into kind of social stories? Like, is there a way they should speak? Is there a specific language they can use?
okay. We are becoming so curious about and then you can tell me if I'm not understanding your question correctly. What you're saying is, how can we take this social story philosophy and perhaps expand it into how people respond, right? And definitely that's true. I think the best way is to have people learn how to write social stories, become very familiar with the philosophy, because I guarantee you, once you start writing social stories, it does start to change how you think. And it does start to change how you interact, not just with those people who may be diagnosed with autism, but with all people. Social stories have definitely made me far less confident of my own opinions and far more open to the possibility that there's a lot to be gained from all of us sharing our perspectives, basically. So, but I think the place to start is you first have to go through the process of writing a social story, and it's interesting you mentioned that because we are gathering information right now about what authors experience as they go through writing a social story. Often very frustrated, you often get stuck. It often can feel like the criteria are so restrictive, but if you stick with it, those criteria actually launch you into a better direction, a more effective topic, and they really do serve you well. I hope I've answered your question. Yeah.
Okay,
I know we have to watch our time. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question.
Oh, okay.
And then we'll finish.
Is there a problem about the generalization of the specific social skill acquired in the social story in the other context of life?
I don't understand the question, probably because I'm accent and jet lag.
Is there a problem about generalization?
Is there a problem with generalization with social stories?
Yeah.
That has been cited in the research quite frequently, that, boy, these stories worked, but we're concerned about the generalization. I think that often people are not doing enough with the knowledge that generalization can be an issue. There's a lot we can do as we develop a social story to support generalization to other contexts, right down to how we implement that story. By having a child read a story in several different contexts where that skill might apply, et cetera, or that information might apply. The information is there about how to support generalization. I think some of the words that we use, et cetera, are critical to developing effective stories. And I think an author is not doing all that they can if they forget to consider generalization issues as they develop a story. A part of every social story training is making people very, very aware of the issues related to generalization and how we address that with the words we use and how we implement the story. And keep watching the story website, carolgraysocialstories.com, because all the information is free, and we are going to be adding some information, social story strategies. Not the criteria, but these are just tricks of the trade, things that we systematically do, things that I do, Siobhan does, some of the most advanced authors of social stories in the world are doing, and we want to gather that information and make that information available to everybody so that people have all the tricks of the trade, and so it can become second nature for everyone. Even though it's not second nature for me yet, I can still spend 24 hours on a story, or more. I'm going to be here, guys, and I'm a friendly person, so I would very much enjoy. I'm here alone. I'm not hanging out with anybody but me, so please come up and chat, and I'd love to meet you and hear about the people that you work with. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.